Today, airplanes cross oceans every hour. People travel between continents in a single day. But for most of human history, flying was only a dream. For thousands of years, people watched birds moving freely through the sky. They wondered how it felt to rise above the ground and travel through the air. Kings, inventors, and scientists all asked the same question. Could humans ever fly like birds? Many people tried to answer that question. Some inventors built wings and jumped from tall towers. Others designed strange machines that looked like giant birds. But these early experiments were extremely dangerous. Most attempts failed. Some ended in serious accidents. For centuries, human flight seemed impossible. Then, in the early 1900s, something remarkable happened. Two brothers from a small bicycle shop in the United States built a flying machine that could carry a person through the air. Their names were Wilbur Wright and Orville Wright. On a cold morning in December 1903, their airplane lifted off the ground for the first time in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The flight lasted only 12 seconds. But those 12 seconds changed human history forever. So how did two ordinary brothers solve one of humanity's greatest challenges? And how did the first airplane finally become a reality? Before airplanes existed, traveling long distances was slow and often difficult. If people wanted to cross an ocean, they had only one choice: travel by ship. A journey from Europe to America in the 1800s could take several weeks. Passengers spent many days at sea, often facing rough waves and powerful storms. Sea travel was not only slow, but also dangerous. Traveling across large countries was also challenging. People used horses, wagons, trains, and ships. Even with trains, which were considered modern technology at the time, journeys were still long. For example, in the late 1800s, traveling from New York to California by train could take many days. Before railroads were built, the journey could take months by wagon. Now imagine traveling between continents or exploring distant parts of the world. It required enormous time, patience, and courage. Communication was also affected by slow travel. Letters were carried by ships or trains, so messages could take weeks or even months to arrive. News moved slowly across the world. Because of these limitations, people often wondered if there could be a faster way to travel. But the dream of flying was not new. For thousands of years, humans looked at birds and imagined what it would be like to move freely through the sky. Many cultures created stories about human flight. In ancient Greece, there is a famous myth about a boy named Icarus. According to the legend, Icarus and his father built wings using feathers and wax so they could escape from an island. Icarus flew too close to the sun, and the wax melted. He fell into the sea. Of course, this story was only a myth, but it showed how deeply humans dreamed about flying. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, the Italian artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci also studied the idea of flight. Around the late 1400s, he carefully observed how birds moved their wings. He drew detailed sketches of flying machines, including designs that looked like gliders and early helicopters. These designs were very advanced for their time. However, the technology needed to build them did not yet exist. Leonardo's machines were never successfully constructed. For many centuries, the dream of human flight remained only an idea. But by the 19th century, science and engineering began to develop rapidly. New discoveries helped scientists better understand the natural world. One important field of study was aerodynamics, the science of how air flows around objects. Researchers began studying how wings interact with moving air. They wanted to understand how birds stay in the air. This led to a new question that fascinated inventors across the world. If birds can fly, could humans build a machine that could do the same? The answer would soon come from an unexpected place: a small bicycle shop in America. At first, flying seemed simple. People looked at birds and thought, maybe humans just need wings. But inventors soon discovered that flying was much more complicated than that. Flying was not simply about building wings and jumping into the air. In reality, inventors had to solve three major scientific problems before human flight could become possible. These problems were lift, power, and control. The first problem, lift. Lift is the force that pushes a flying machine upward into the air. Birds create lift naturally with their wings. When birds flap or glide, the shape and movement of their wings allow air to move faster above the wing than below it. This difference in air pressure helps lift the bird into the sky. But humans needed to understand how to create this effect using machines. Scientists began studying how air flows over different shapes. They discovered that curved wings, also called airfoils, could help produce lift when air moved across them. This discovery was very important. However, understanding lift was only the first step. The second problem, power. Even if a machine could glide through the air, it still needed power to move forward. Gliders can stay in the air for a short time, but without an engine, they cannot continue flying for long distances. Early flying machines had a serious problem. Engines were too heavy. Engines in the 1800s were designed for trains and factories. They produced power, but they were large and extremely heavy. A flying machine needed an engine that was both powerful and lightweight. This combination was very difficult to achieve with the technology of that time. The third problem, control. The most difficult challenge was control. A flying machine must be able to turn, stay balanced, and adjust its position in the air. Without proper control, the machine could easily lose balance and crash. Many early inventors focused mainly on lift and power, but they ignored the problem of control. As a result, many early flying machines were unstable and dangerous. One famous aviation pioneer was Otto Lilienthal, a German engineer who studied bird flight. In the late 1800s, Lilienthal built several gliders and successfully made more than 2,000 flights. His experiments proved that controlled gliding was possible. However, in 1896, Lilienthal lost control of his glider during a flight and crashed. He died from his injuries the next day. His death shocked the scientific community, but it also showed how dangerous early flight experiments were. By the end of the 19th century, many scientists believed that human flight was possible. But solving the three great problems, lift, power, and control, required new ideas, careful experiments, and a completely different way of thinking. And those ideas would soon come from two unexpected inventors, who were not famous scientists at all. The story of the first successful airplane begins with two brothers from the United States, Wilbur Wright and Orville Wright. Wilbur Wright was born in 1867, and his younger brother Orville Wright was born in 1871. They grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a curious and thoughtful family. Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop in a religious church, and he strongly encouraged his children to read, learn, and explore new ideas. One day, when the boys were still young, their father brought home a small flying toy. It was a simple device made of paper, cork, and rubber bands. When the rubber band was twisted and released, the toy's wings spun quickly, and the small machine rose into the air for a moment before falling gently back to the ground. The two boys watched in amazement. That small toy may have seemed unimportant, but it sparked something powerful in their imagination. From that moment, the idea of flight fascinated them. As the brothers grew older, their curiosity about machines continued to grow. However, they did not attend famous universities, and they did not become professional scientists. Instead, in the 1890s, they opened a bicycle repair and sales shop in Dayton. At that time, bicycles were extremely popular in the United States, and many people relied on them for transportation. Running a bicycle shop taught the Wright brothers many important skills. They learned about mechanics, balance, gears, and the movement of machines. They repaired broken parts, designed improvements, and solved mechanical problems every day. Through this work, they developed practical engineering skills, even though they had no formal training. This hands-on experience would later become one of their greatest advantages. In 1896, an event occurred that deeply influenced them. News spread about the death of Otto Lilienthal, the German aviation pioneer, who had conducted thousands of glider flights while studying how birds fly. Lilienthal's experiments proved that human flight might be possible, But his fatal crash also showed how dangerous early flight experiments were. When the Wright brothers read about his work and his death, they became determined to understand the science of flight more seriously. They began studying everything they could find about aviation. They read books, research papers, and scientific reports written by earlier pioneers. Among the people they studied were Otto Lilienthal, who carefully analyzed bird flight; Octave Chanute, an engineer who collected and shared knowledge about gliders; and Samuel Langley, an American scientist who was attempting to build powered flying machines. But while studying these inventors, the Wright brothers noticed something interesting. Many inventors were focusing mainly on building stronger engines. They believed that if they could create a powerful engine, flight would become possible. The Wright brothers, however, believed that another problem was even more important. They believed the true key to flight was control. A flying machine could not simply rise into the air. It needed to remain stable, turn safely, and respond to the pilot's movements. Without proper control, any flying machine would quickly lose balance and crash. To understand this problem better, the brothers began observing birds very carefully. They spent long periods watching how birds moved in the wind. They noticed something important. Birds did not only flap their wings up and down. When they turned in the air, birds often twisted their wings slightly. This twisting motion allowed them to control their direction and balance. The Wright brothers realized that a flying machine might be able to use a similar method. If the wings of an aircraft could change shape slightly, the pilot might be able to control the aircraft in the air. They called this idea wing warping. By twisting the wings in opposite directions, the aircraft could tilt and turn. This concept later became one of the most important innovations in early aviation and eventually led to the modern system of aircraft control. Now the Wright brothers needed a place where they could test their ideas safely. They searched for a location that had strong, steady winds, wide open spaces, and soft ground for landing in case of crashes. After studying weather reports, they chose Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a small coastal area known for its steady winds and large sandy dunes. The location was remote and quiet, but it offered perfect conditions for testing experimental flying machines. It was here, on the windy sands of Kitty Hawk, that two brothers from a bicycle shop would begin the experiments that would soon change human history forever. The Wright brothers understood that building a flying machine would require patience, careful experiments, and many failures. They did not expect success immediately. Instead, they believed progress would come step by step. Between 1900 and 1902, they built and tested several experimental gliders in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. A glider is an aircraft without an engine. It cannot produce its own power, but it can glide through the air using wind and lift created by its wings. Gliders were important because they allowed the brothers to study flight without worrying about engines at first. They wanted to solve the problem of control before adding power. Their first glider, built in 1900, was relatively small. It had a wingspan of about 17 feet and used the wing warping system they had designed to help control direction. During early tests, Wilbur Wright often lay on the lower wing while the glider was controlled using ropes connected to the wings. The winds at Kitty Hawk were strong, which helped the glider lift off the ground. However, the results were not perfect. Many flights were short, and sometimes the glider did not produce enough lift to stay in the air for long. Still, the brothers learned important lessons from every attempt. In 1901, they returned to Kitty Hawk with a larger and improved glider. They hoped the new design would produce much more lift. But the results were disappointing. The glider still did not perform as well as expected. It struggled to stay in the air, and its control was difficult. Wilbur Wright later said that this was one of the most discouraging moments in their work. For a short time, the brothers even considered giving up their dream of flight. However, instead of quitting, they began to question the scientific data they were using. Much of the aerodynamic information available at the time came from earlier experiments conducted by scientists such as Otto Lilienthal. The Wright brothers began to suspect that some of this data might not be accurate. To test their ideas, they decided to do something very unusual for two bicycle mechanics. they built their own wind tunnel. A wind tunnel is a device used to study how air flows around objects. It is essentially a long box with air moving through it, allowing scientists to test different shapes and measure how air interacts with them. In late 1901, the Wright brothers constructed a small wind tunnel in their bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. Inside this wind tunnel, they placed small model wings made of metal. They then measured how air flowed over different shapes. Through these experiments, they tested more than 200 different wing designs. This careful research helped them understand exactly which wing shapes produce the most lift and stability. The wind tunnel experiments became one of the most important breakthroughs in the history of aviation. The Wright brothers discovered that many earlier measurements of lift were incorrect. Using their new data, they redesigned their glider wings to be more efficient and stable. In 1902, they returned once again to Kitty Hawk with a completely new glider based on their wind tunnel experiments. This new glider was far more successful than their previous designs. It had improved wings and a more advanced control system that included a movable rear rudder working together with wing warping. For the first time, the Wright brothers were able to control their aircraft reliably in the air. The pilot could turn left or right, maintain balance, and guide the glider safely back to the ground. During the 1902 tests, the brothers made hundreds of successful glider flights. Some flights lasted more than 20 seconds, which was a major achievement at the time. At last, they had solved the most difficult challenge in aviation: control. Now only one major problem remained: power. To achieve powered flight, they needed an engine that was both strong and lightweight. Unfortunately, no such engine existed on the market. Most engines at that time were designed for automobiles or industrial machines, and they were far too heavy for a flying machine. Once again, the Wright brothers decided to build their own solution. With the help of their skilled mechanic Charlie Taylor, they designed and built a custom gasoline engine in their workshop. The engine was made mostly from aluminum to reduce weight. It produced about 12 horsepower, which was enough to power their aircraft while remaining light enough for flight. Next, they designed 2 large wooden propellers. At the time, propeller design was not well understood, so the brothers studied the mathematics of how propellers move through air. They realized that propellers were similar to rotating wings and needed to be carefully shaped for efficiency. The propellers were connected to the engine using a system of chains and gears, similar to those used on bicycles. This clever design allowed both propellers to spin at the same time, creating strong forward thrust. By late 1903, their powered flying machine was finally ready. The aircraft had a wingspan of about 40 feet, a lightweight wooden frame, fabric-covered wings, and the engine they had built themselves. The pilot would lie on the lower wing to reduce air resistance while controlling the aircraft with hip movements and levers. The Wright brothers called their invention the Wright Flyer. It was the result of years of careful experiments, hundreds of tests, and many failures. But now, after solving the problems of lift, control, and power, they were ready to attempt something that had never been achieved before: a powered, controlled flight by a human in a heavier-than-air machine. After years of experiments, failures, and improvements, the Wright brothers were finally ready to test their powered flying machine. The date was December 17, 1903. The location was the windy sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. That morning, the weather was cold, and strong winds blew across the open fields near the coast. These winds, however, were exactly what the brothers needed to help their aircraft lift into the air. Only a small number of people were there to witness the event. A few local residents and members of a nearby life-saving station watched with curiosity. No large crowd was present. No newspapers had arrived. At that moment, very few people realized that history was about to change. The Wright brothers prepared the Wright Flyer on a wooden launching rail placed on the sand. Because the aircraft had no wheels, the rail helped guide the plane forward as it gained speed. For the first attempt, Orville Wright lay on the lower wing of the airplane. The pilot flew the aircraft while lying down to reduce air resistance. Wilbur Wright stood beside the machine, ready to help steady the wing and guide the plane as it began moving. At 10:35 in the morning, the engine started and the propellers began to spin. The airplane moved forward along the rail. Wilbur ran beside it for a few seconds to keep the wings balanced. Then, something extraordinary happened. The airplane slowly lifted off the ground. For the first time in human history, a powered, heavier-than-air machine carrying a person rose into the sky under full control. The first flight lasted only 12 seconds and traveled about 36 meters, or 120 feet. By modern standards, this may seem very short. But at that moment, it was a historic achievement. Humans had finally succeeded in controlled powered flight. The Wright brothers did not stop after the first attempt. Throughout the day, they made 3 more flights. Each flight went farther and lasted longer than the previous one. The final flight of the day was piloted by Wilbur Wright and lasted 59 seconds, traveling about 852 feet, or approximately 260 meters. This final flight clearly proved that their invention worked. For the first time, a powered aircraft could take off, stay in the air, and land safely under the pilot's control. It was a moment that would eventually transform transportation and change the world. Surprisingly, however, the news did not immediately spread across the world. Many newspapers did not believe the story at first. Some reporters thought the claim sounded impossible. As a result, the Wright brothers' achievement did not receive much attention in the beginning. But over the next few years, aviation technology began to develop rapidly. The Wright brothers continued improving their airplanes and demonstrated their flights publicly. By 1908 and 1909, they were showing their aircraft in the United States and Europe. Crowds gathered to watch the machines rise into the sky. Engineers, governments, and investors suddenly realized that aviation had enormous potential. Airplanes could change travel, communication, exploration, and even warfare. By 1909, airplanes were already being demonstrated in several countries, and aviation had become one of the most exciting new technologies in the world. What began as a small experiment on the windy sands of Kitty Hawk had opened a completely new chapter in human history. The age of flight had begun. Today, airplanes connect the entire world in ways that people in the past could only imagine. Every day, millions of passengers travel across countries and continents by air. A journey that once required weeks on a ship can now take only a few hours in a modern airplane. For example, flying from New York to London today takes about 7 hours, while in the 1800s the same journey across the Atlantic Ocean could take several weeks by sea. Airplanes have changed many parts of modern life. They made global travel faster and easier. They helped expand international trade, allowing goods to move quickly between countries. They also helped tourism grow, making it possible for people to explore distant cultures and places. Scientists use airplanes to study the Earth, explore remote environments, and even conduct research in the atmosphere. Airplanes have also influenced world history. During major conflicts such as World War I and World War II, aircraft became important tools for transportation, reconnaissance, and military strategy. Over time, aviation technology continued to develop, leading to larger passenger planes, cargo aircraft, and even spacecraft. But when we look back at the beginning of this story, it all started in a very simple way. It began with 2 brothers who were curious about how birds fly. Wilbur and Orville Wright were not famous scientists, and they were not wealthy engineers. They were bicycle mechanics with a strong curiosity and a willingness to experiment. Their story teaches us an important lesson. Many of the world's greatest inventions begin with a simple question and a desire to understand how things work. Innovation often requires patience, creativity, and the courage to continue after failure. Now we would like to ask you a question. What invention has changed your life the most? Is it the airplane? The internet? Or maybe the smartphone you use every day? Tell us your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy learning English through fascinating history stories, like this video, comment your favorite invention. And subscribe to Invention English for more stories that help you improve your English. Because behind every great invention, there is always a great story waiting to be discovered.